We'll talk a little bit about the location advantage or disadvantage of India being the place. Okay.
So how do you compete against the large companies like HP? Right? What are the strengths you have and what are the challenges you face?
Good, good. Okay, so this is more about how do you take the incumbents head on, when you actually have a product that has a few customers and now you really have to scale, then how do you really compete with the big guys? Yeah?
One more, seed funding and the initial funding of building a product. Because you can see you are 5 years kind of ahead of the industry. So how did you kind of convince people to receive your work?
Okay. Starting with the first raise itself, how do you really...
At what stage do you go to the people?
Okay. Okay, so we have a smattering of questions. I'll start with, in the chronological order, starting with your question, probably the first one. And maybe even before that, how do you conceive of a disruptive product? So, starting a new business is about two things. One is you need to be with people who are equally hungry, and then you spend like 6 to 9 months just talking to them and getting to know these people who will end up being your partners, in crime, And you talk about a lot of things. You don't just talk about the one idea and go deep. You look at it broadly. It's like, what are the various things we'd actually end up doing? And in the process, you'll get to know one or two of these people really well. Then maybe in the next, in those 2 months that you have looked at, like say 10, 15 different ideas, one of them will start to come together and you'll go deeper in that one idea. So here is where you have to be careful, because there's this shiny object that you might see, oh, there's a froth here, there's a hype here, maybe we should go after that idea, versus what is your strength, or what's the strength of the team. And you should always go with the strength of the team, because it's going to be the thing that will actually be your biggest competitive advantage, as opposed to trying to be something else that you are not. What do I mean by that? Maybe you are not good at B2C, or you're good at building systems. So you're like, well, if I start a B2C company, my strength will not be used in a B2C company right away. Because in most consumer startups, infrastructure comes second. First you need to build a brand and a product, and then eventually you'll go and iteratively fix the back end and infrastructure and so on. So be careful not to go after the shiny object out there, and really understand who you are and what the strength of the team is. Then I think it is a lot about connecting the dots, about things that are happening in other domains. It doesn't have to be the exact same domain that you are used to, but you can, like for example, when we were starting Nutanix, we looked at Hadoop very carefully, and we said, look, if Hadoop is trying to collapse the infrastructure for these next generation big data apps, then how about we did the same for all apps, basically for all the legacy applications that have come to exist in the last 20, 25 years. And that was the core kernel of Nutanix's idea, that let's go and build a Hadoop for everything. Not just for the next generation NoSQL apps, not just for the next generation MapReduce applications and so on, but also for SQL Exchange, Oracle, SAP, desktops, and so on and so forth. So that was the core idea. And then the idea, typically is not everything. Initially you'll start out with something and say, let's start to do some more research on it. And the general area is what you pick up, because the team is now signed up for the general area that, look, we'll actually build a Hadoop-like thing for everything. It's very fuzzy, very nebulous in the beginning. But then you try to go deeper, you start to look at what are the pain points in this area. And like in our case, we started looking at the pain points of virtualization, and look, the notion of a SAN was basically a retrofit. I mean, it was being force-fit into virtualization, and storage arrays were not built for virtualization. So we started really looking at all the weaknesses of existing systems and so on. And I think that just becomes a virtuous cycle. So you start reading more. So read a lot, by the way. I think you guys, anybody who's starting a company, a founder is a product manager. So don't try to delegate product management to someone else, because what are the biggest strengths of founder? You have to know what to build, and you have to know how to close people, because these are the two things that no one else can do for you. You know what to build and how to close. Initially, you're closing people. You're not really closing sales or closing customers, but you really, and if you're not good at it, then you practice, because apart from the founders, nobody can close people. And initially what you have is just an idea. It's a very fuzzy thing, and it's just a deck of slides and nothing more than that. Because closing people also means you'll know how to close VCs someday. Again, VCs will look at how passionate you are. Have you quit your job? If you're that deep into it, do you have a general breadth of understanding about the domain that you're talking about, and so on. And last but not the least, drawing parallels, I think, analogies with other companies, other industries, other verticals. Business history, be really good at business history. If you guys have not followed business history for the last 30 years, just go and just learn a lot about everything that happened in the 80s when people moved from mainframes to client server, how Oracle was built, how Microsoft was built, how Adobe was built, how Cisco was built. Go to the 90s, start to figure out what happened to Oracle in the 90s, how did it beat Sybase in Informix, how Microsoft went from being a productivity software company to a desktop company to a data center company. There's a lot of history, and very rich history in the last 30 years, which will not just be good for you to, as part of your narrative, because every time people come and say, I don't think this is possible, you'll actually draw from history and say, it was done in the past, this is how it was done. And everybody appreciates that. Your prospective employees will appreciate that, your prospective VCs will appreciate that, because there's nothing richer than history. And you don't have to go 50 years and learn about how IBM was built, but just the last 30 years, there's a lot of rich history. And there were big transitions, and transitions going from, as I said, mainframe to client server to internet, to virtualization, to the world that we are in today. So figure out how, learn a lot about the companies in your space, and companies that are in adjacent spaces. Like, just because you are a data center guy doesn't mean you shouldn't know about networking or security or in general, other infrastructure companies. And I think it's good to know about consumer companies too, because no next generation infrastructure company can just be a back-end company. So that's the other point I want to emphasize today, that if, of course, if you're a B2C company, you have to figure out design and think about usability and ease of use and churn rates and drop-off rates and a lot of things that relate back to the flow of the application and the web tier. But no infrastructure company worth its salt today can only be left-brained. So you have to have an awesome right brain as well. And by right brain, I mean things that are easy to use and are intuitive and have a very consumer-grade facet to them. It's like the way you interact with your Apple phone is the way you should interact with infrastructure. I mean, I think if you don't have that zeal and passion, then I think you'll actually build incomplete systems, because the world is changing very quickly. I think consumers who are good with iPads and iPhones are the same guys who actually go and deal with infrastructure as well. So their expectations are very high. And what's happening is, I mean, I'm sure you guys have realized about your own personal lives that we are trying to do more in less time. So everything is compressing, right? In the way we have our own personal goals, what we want to do, communicate with others. What used to get done in 20 years started getting done in 10 years, started getting done in 5 years, 3 years, 2 years. They're all becoming machines here, right? So the one thing that we don't have is time. The most precious commodity or resource in our lives is our own time. So if you go and save someone's time, they're willing to pay for it a lot. They'll pay a lot of money for it. So make some things 10x easier to use, people will pay loads of money to you. And the reason is because You're not selling them a thing. You're not selling them a box. You're selling them an experience. If you listen to Deepak Chopra, he'll say most people pay a lot of money for buying experience. When they buy a thing, the euphoria comes and goes away. When you buy like your next iWatch or iPhone 6 or whatever, you like it for a few days and you'll move on. But if you think about vacation, it's an experience, right? Before the vacation, you're looking forward to the vacation. After the vacation, you have memories of the vacation. And that's what people are willing to pay a lot of money for. So whatever you do, I mean, these days the most popular apps in the mobile space, the most popular infrastructure is all about selling an experience and buying an experience. So figure it out that just because you are a infrastructure guy doesn't mean that you can actually ignore design. Design, not just at the back end and scalable systems and reliable systems, but also front end of just easy to use things. I mean, Nutanix, we are doing a lot of innovation, which is very mundane. It's like, okay, how do you make upgrades like Apple's upgrades, like auto downloads and one-click everything, and we are pushing the envelope on just a simple thing like upgrades. And you won't believe how much time is actually spent in two very mundane things in the data center, just in our space. Data migration and software upgrades are the two things that administrators spend 80% of their lives on. Their entire lives are spent on upgrading software and migrating data. So if you can make this 10x easier, people will pay a lot of money to you. So I think, I talked about the tenets of, a few tenets of what the next generation product should look like. Now let's get to how do you raise money. There's no formula for it. I think initially, and I was saying this yesterday as well, you need to know your BATNA. And this is an acronym that I copy from our advisor. His name is Deepak Malhotra. He's a professor of negotiation at Harvard Business School. And BATNA stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. So what is your walkaway point going to look like? And what is that alternative? You need to have that. Independent of how rich or poor you are, you need to know, if I don't raise this money, then what do I have? Do I have a provident fund or 401k, or can I dip into all that? That's when I quit. It's not like I had a lot of money, but the one thing I had was my 401k. I said, you know what, worst case, I'll just dip into that. And I had a sign off. My wife was actually willing to take that risk with me. So all of you, budding entrepreneurs who want to go and do things, make sure that it's actually a family decision. It can't be just your call. Your spouses have to be equally signed into this as much as you are. Because if you're not, then you won't have peace at home, and that's not a good thing. Because when you go home, you can't be arguing about why you're doing something and how come you're spending so much time on your startup. So because it's a life in itself, and unless you are totally signed in, and that includes your family signed in, it's a very difficult thing to pull off actually. And it includes even things like BATNAs, where you go and discuss with your wife or your husband, look, all we have is our 401k, or the provident fund as you call it here. Can we dip into it if push came to shove? And if nobody gave you the money, we'll dip into it, we'll start with the initial stuff. And you'll have to do unnatural things to really, because initially most people, I mean, let's face it, most VCs that passed on Nutanix today are extremely apologetic about it. They're like, oh, you know what, I should have done this. I'm like, you couldn't have helped it, because hindsight is 20/20. And it's very difficult to actually, upfront say, this is how it's going to be, because I myself didn't know that this company would be this big in just 5 years. So in hindsight, a lot of these guys would have invested in you. And keep that in mind, that just because they refused doesn't mean that your idea is not worth it, or whatever you've done is actually worthless. So angel money is actually good. Friends and family, I would actually think twice, thrice, 4, 5 times, 10 times before taking money from friends and family early on. it's okay to give them stock when you have become successful, but not when you're starting bootstrapping, because money can actually mess up relationships. So I'd be very careful taking money from friends and family. The people who do this for business, they call angels, and go and dip into the angels, and they'll be willing to give you 100, 200K, which is actually a pretty good thing for a place like India as well. Let's see. I was trying to go a little bit in chronological order. The third question is about selling. How do you sell early on and get the first few customers? But before that, the really important and strategic decision is, what is a minimal viable product? And there's an acronym people use called MVP. What is the minimal viable product? And you'll fight a lot between the founders, because the founders are the product managers. Remember, I think you cannot delegate product management to anybody else but yourself. And knowing what will click early on is not an easy decision, because most of us who come from engineering backgrounds have a feature creep mentality, like, oh, put 3 more things and all of a sudden it'll actually become that much more sellable. And that is not true. Also, what is not true, like initially, most customers told us not to build Nutanix. So again, it's very counterintuitive. Your customers will never tell you what to build. By the way, I want to acknowledge the country head of Nutanix India. His name is Namit Jain. He sits right there, standing right there, and I owe a lot to him in terms of building this business right here. Comes out of Facebook, really prolific developer. He actually was a big contributor to HBase before here at Facebook, and now he's really diversified into everything, not just into R&D, but into hiring, operations, and I owe a lot to him. So thank you, Namit, for being here as well. So yeah, your customers will not tell you what to build, and that is very, very important to know, because most customers are incrementalists. They want an evolutionary something, And the place where they'll help you is when you have a product. Then they'll go and tell you, build this adjacency, build this integration with that ecosystem, enhance that here, and so on. So don't depend on customers to start your business. Very, very important, actually. Because as I said, 99% of all the feedback that we got early on was Nutanix couldn't be built and shouldn't be built, because these are 2 different silos and 2 different territories, and there are different refresh cycles. People never will collapse them together, so on and so forth. And especially customers of large enterprises, never talk to them about what to build, because these are traditionally conservative buyers, and they'll never direct you in that direction. Yeah, you know what, you can go and disrupt this. And always think about this. When you go to a prospect, if they say, no, I don't like what you just said, doesn't mean a thing. Why? Because product adoption is a bell curve. So just keep the bell curve in mind. Every time you get a rejection, keep the bell curve in mind. And then the bell curve has 5 sections, for those of you who remember the product adoption curve: innovators, early adopters, early majority, and then you get the rite of passage to get to the late majority and the laggards, right? You can never talk to a laggard and get an answer, so yeah, I love the product, because they'll say, you know what, I don't think it's useful for me because of X, Y, and Z reasons. In all probability, they're a laggard or a late majority, and they will come to you after you've sold it to the first 1,000 customers. And it's a rite of passage. By the way, those guys are the richest people. They'll have the most money. When they start to like you, they'll buy a lot of you. But it's just the nature of the game. You have to walk on fire to get to them. And that's the difficulty of building a business, that you have to cross the hump to get to the late majority and the laggards, who are the richest customers, actually, who have the most amount of money as well. So don't listen to these guys. Listen to your gut and instinct. Don't be blind, by the way. Again, this is where, by the way, I'm running out of time, right? But there is another session at 4:50, and I'm going to go through the deck a little bit, just talk about our journey as well. We'll talk about a few things that are very counterintuitive, like near-death experiences, and we had 2 of them in this company. So it's never all hunky-dory, like, wow, you guys are a $2 billion company in 5 years, everything was awesome. No, I think there's a lot of things that actually do go wrong as well. And fortune favors the brave, so you have to be tenacious. And remember, what differentiates you against somebody who just keeps talking about building a business is your mental fortitude, the fact that you took the jump. And the same mental fortitude will actually help you through the highs and lows of building a business. The best advice I got when I was starting the company was, look, it's going to be like this. Don't ride the highs and lows. There's an average, and just stay on the average. Nothing can be really good, and nothing can be really that bad. If you keep that in mind, I think good things will actually happen. So that being said, thank you for the attention. 4:50 I have a session, so we'll do more of this there as well. Okay, thank you.